What's your favourite bird? Mine, I think, is the raven. It's such a magnificent bird. It's full of character and charisma, and we're lucky that where I live, we get to see them as they cruise along the Jurassic coastline in Dorset and East Devon. I also love Raven because he's in lots of stories as a trickster and as a creator. So here is a magical myth about the beginning of the world with Raven playing the lead role. In the beginning, there was no tide. No tide in the sea, no shallows along the coast. The seawater, undisturbed by the rise and fall of the tide, was always held at the high water mark. And in those days, all the different birds who liked to be beside the sea, trying to eke out a living, had no idea that just underneath the waves there was a cornucopia of sumptuous seafood. Oysters and clams, mussels and crabs, delicious delicacies, but hidden, out of reach, beneath the deep and tideless sea. But there was one cunning creature who knew about this hidden feast, one brainy bird who lived up on the cliff tops at Burton Bradstock, and his name was Raven. Raven the trickster, Raven the explorer, Raven the scientist, Raven the storyteller. Raven, with his dark, glinting eyes, had seen the underwater seafood and, with his clever mind, had calculated that if he could just move the sea, just a little bit, just for a short time, then there would be rich and plentiful pickings for all the birds along the coast to enjoy, and they would pipe their praises to him, to Raven. Well, even though he was indeed cunning and clever, Raven didn't know, in fact, how to move the sea. And he realised he knew very little about oceanography. And so he decided to seek the help of someone who did, and that someone was Fogman. Fogman, ancient and wise, sitting beside the sea, covered with his cloak of mist and moisture. He would know how to move the sea. So Raven began to fly up and down the Jurassic coast, asking all of the birds if they knew where to find Fogman. He flew to Seatown to ask the sandpipers, but when they heard Raven's harsh, cronking sound, they lifted up into the air and drifted away like a swirl of smoke. So he went to see the free-flying fulmars at West Bay, but they already had the wind beneath their stiff wings and were soaring far out to sea in search of fish. So he called in on the cormorants at Cogden Beach, standing as still as sentinels on the wet black rocks, but they kept their watch and they kept their silence. Until eventually, at Abbotsbury, he asked an oyster catcher, and when she heard of Raven's request to find Fogman, she nodded her little head and then opened up her black and white wings and started to fly, piping out a call from her little red bill. "Follow me, follow me, follow me." And so Raven followed Oystercatcher, flying along the whole length of Chesil Beach until they came to Portland. Portland, of course! Where else would Fogman live? And at the end of the island of Portland is a cave, and there, sitting on the sandy floor, brooding and breathing heavily, listening to the wind and the waves, was Fogman. When he saw Raven flying into the entrance of Cave Hole, he picked up his cloak of moisture and began to surround himself in mist and moisture to hide himself. But Raven was quick and Raven was clever. In a flash, he grabbed the cloak in his beak and snatched it from his back. "Give me back my cloak," demanded Fogman. Yes, said Raven, I will, just as soon as you have told me how to move the sea." "Don't be absurd, bird, you couldn't move the sea." "Oh, well, then I think I'll just keep this cool cloak of yours for myself. I think it rather suits me." "Very well," said Fogman. "I'll tell you, you need to find the man who sits on the tide, old Harry himself. He's the only one that can move the sea. You'll find him far to the east from here, in the waters of Studland Bay. Now give me back my cloak." Raven, the trickster, for a minute he hesitated, but then eventually he returned the cloak to Fogman, and off he flew to the east, flapping as fast as he could, until eventually he saw ahead of him, rising out of the grey sea, a stack of white rock. Old Harry's rocks. But as he flew closer, he saw that the rocks were in fact the huge and hulking figure of a giant, with boulders for bones, a beard of dripping green weed, and eyes of flashing silver herrings. In a moment of mercurial magic, Raven knew what to do. He soared up into the sky as high as he could fly, and then turned around before plummeting down beak first, like a black feathered dart, towards Old Harry's great white rump. His sharp beak stabbed and jabbed into the back of the giant, who immediately jumped up and roared in anger, and his great body flailing in the sea, looking for the source of the pain. But Raven was already gone, flying away home. But now that Old Harry, the man who sits on the tide, was standing up, the sea receded, leaving shallow waters, and underneath a shore littered with tasty treasures, oysters and clams and mussels and crabs. And soon all the birds along the coast, they were enjoying a fine seafood feast, and they piped out their praise to Raven for all his cleverness and cunning. And so it's true. From that day on, Raven returned to jab the bottom of Old Harry, who sits on the tide, twice a day, slightly different times each day, just to keep the giant literally on his toes. And as Old Harry sits and stands, so the tide rises and falls. And don't take my word for it, you can go and see the tide for yourself. And Old Harry, he's still there, standing in Studland Bay. And as for Raven, he still lives in Burton Bradstock, up on the cliffs, and I saw him myself there this morning.